Hey, what's up, everyone? So this is Alex here, and I'd like to review the first ever European Othello Championship that happened on 3rd of July. So I think, as far as I know, there has been many Othello championships like Paris Open, Stockholm Open. So usually there would be many Othello competitions that are held across Europe, and a series of these tournaments used to be labeled under the European Grand Prix. So typically European players would probably travel around, play at different places, play a whole series of tournaments, and each of these tournaments would kind of be similar to maybe like a tennis ATP tour, where they basically have different points for different ranking people, and then they would sum up the rankings and then figure out who's the European Grand Prix champion. So I think this time it's a bit different. This time they held it in Rome, and they call it the first European Othello Championship, gathering most of the strongest players in Europe. I believe maybe a few might be missing, but I think you would have most of the former world Othello champions here from Europe. So, and obviously a lot of former world top 10 and world semi-finalist players playing in this tournament. So I'll quickly run through the standings first, and then we'll probably go into the quick review of the semifinals, the third, fourth placing, and also the finals game. So basically, the system of the first European Othello Championship was 11 rounds Swiss pairing, and after 11 rounds Swiss pairing, you get this final ranking list over here with everyone's results, and essentially the top two would go into a best of three finals game, and the third and fourth would go into a best of ones third, fourth placing match. So yeah, let's quickly run through the list. So obviously Alejandro Di Mattei from Italy did very well to actually get a total of 9 points out of a possible 11 rounds with a relatively good tiebreak score. And of course, Matthias Berg, he came back from behind. I think he probably dropped a game earlier on in the few rounds, and then somehow he managed to fight back and eventually come back on top. So that's typical Matthias, classic. And Michael Barassi, obviously he's a former world Othello champion in 2009, I think. So yeah, 2008 world Othello champion actually. So obviously he's also a very, very strong player and always coming up in the top few. Mr. Takuji Kashiwabara is the fourth person to kind of round up the top four field and go into the third, fourth match with Michael Barassi. So Takuji Kashiwabara, he's actually a Japanese professor who actually works in France. So obviously, I think he is a mathematician, and he is very, very good with the book openings that he learns. So usually it's very, very hard to kind of get past him, given how experienced and seasoned he is as well. So obviously the other players are also equally experienced and seasoned, but I think Mr. Takuji is also a former European Grand Prix champion as far as I know. And obviously the next two, fifth and sixth place, Oscar and Niklas from Sweden. Both of them are actually very strong players. I think Oscar is a relatively young and upcoming player who's done very, very well, even at the World Othello Championship. Marc Tastet from France, he's actually a former World Othello champion, and basically very strong. He had a very nice game with Michael Barassi, so that was a draw in round two. Very, very nice game. And of course, Nikki to me is probably usually the top Dutch player at World Othello Championships. He performs very well. So unfortunately, I think it seems like usually you would expect him to be at least in the higher rankings, but he was just the highest Brightwell among the 7 wins. But I think 7 wins out of 11 games is still very impressive. Even for me, if I were to go to this championship, I probably wouldn't be super confident to say that I'll definitely get 7 wins and above. But yeah, it's a very tough draw. So basically, Nikki is also a former World Othello Championship semi-finalist. So yeah, it's hard to kind of like fault this field considering how strong this field is. And if we just quickly go down the list, you'll see Roel from Netherlands, and you also see Roberto from Italy, also does very well at the World Othello Championship. Paolo, he's a relatively new player who hasn't done that well in the past, but he's done extremely well in this tournament, getting 7 wins, and also a personal friend of mine. So obviously, congratulations to him. And then you have a whole series of Italian players. So obviously, home ground does have some advantage, and then you also have a couple of players below. So I think a total of 60 over players registered for this tournament, but only 52 managed to make it. Probably people were busy or afraid of COVID, but I think it's a very interesting draw. So I would say easily the top 8 players are probably World Othello Championship top 4 material potentially. So it's a very, very strong tournament, and obviously it's a very good thing to actually have once in a while in the major events coming out of COVID-19. So yeah, let's take a quick look at the third, fourth match, and then we'll jump quickly into the finals. So let's now take a look at liveothello.com. Liveothello.com is basically a website that allows you to kind of project your games for a table judge to kind of be at the game and run through the sequence and clock down the games as it goes. And people are able to kind of jump on as a guest, so you can indicate your own names below, have some chat, make some comments on the game, and basically you can look through games. And now they allow kind of 2 parallel games to be watched. So we have the third, fourth game on this panel and the final game 1 on this panel. So let's quickly run through the third, fourth game that played between Takuji and Mikhail Borassi. So Takuji was black. Not too sure whether Borassi had the right of choice of color or draw win, and therefore chose white as a safer play. But yeah, basically Takuji went with Black Tiger opening, which is quite typical book, and Mikhail Borassi went with the Taminori opening variation. So this is kind of the start of the Taminori opening. So nothing too surprising over here, as both players are very seasoned players and they play through the book sequence. So even up to here, it's kind of perfect play for both sides in terms of the book. So all the way up to here, move 24, both players have played 12 moves, so you can see the depth is pretty amazing for both players. I think up to here, 26, it's probably still perfect play even up to here. So I think maybe something that kind of deviated was a bit of F1 perhaps. It could still be the best move, but over here a slight variation. I think the sequence to kind of C2 and the H2 exchange. Typically one would expect black to go to H2, that's the usual sequence. I think Takuji studied this and kind of flipped up the sequence a little bit, went to C2 first, kind of maybe try to bait an error, and followed by H2 and white committing down to F2 to squeeze in, and followed by black jumping in and white going for the X square. I think over here there might be a slight disadvantage beginning over here for white because it allows black to kind of sweep, which black did eventually do to b3, so it's kind of threatening a swindle. So with black playing b3 and making g3 to g6 all black, and establishing f3, he's kind of threatening for h1 and at the same time going for a swindle. So over here, to kind of prevent the swindle, white can only choose h6 or h7. I think if h6 is chosen, h6, h7, g5, this is still very vulnerable to attack by black to kind of sweep it up, and there'll still be a swindle. So maybe that's why Borassi chose h7 to kind of ensure that g6 is still there. But with this, anytime when black takes h1, white would be forced to kind of respond to g1, which is probably not that favorable with a black-white, and then followed by black approaching this corner sequence. White doesn't really yield much. So I think with this exchange, black has successfully kind of secured some advantage for sure against white. So yeah, I think it's quite amazing. With even like a 1-2 move switch, you can change up the game so much. So kudos to black for making it difficult for white. So over here, black did another sweep down, kind of to maybe momentarily prevent g7, and then white surprisingly didn't respond to the lower left, but instead went into center over here. So yeah, black closed off, white again over here. White didn't go in here. Maybe the concern was it was running out of moves, and also at the same time, if white were to go to c6, anytime black takes h1, white jumps into g1 and sweeps this column of white this, then this h6 becomes a quiet move where black can take consecutive moves. So probably that's the concern. So after that, white kind of realized that white was in a difficult position and it would not be able to kind of come back from then on. I think it became rather one-sided because white was forced into a c-square. It's still a nice move by Borassi, but I think black kind of firmly controlled the center by just cutting and maintaining within these squares over here, just keeping the shape. So once black has kind of carved out this top right shape that is stabilized, that white is kind of controlled and has a forced response, then it was kind of over for white to some extent. So over here black kind of identified correctly that, hey, I'll jump into a4, force feed the a7, and then do that maneuver to h1. So I think it's a very beautiful maneuver by Takuji. I think the game was kind of set in stone early on in the opening variation that he did. So black jumped in for the quiet move, and thereafter I think there was no way back for Mr. Borassi, unfortunately. So I think a very beautiful game and variation by Black Tiger against the Taminori variation. So very interesting. So over here, I think it was a fairly, unfortunately, for Borassi, it's a very straightforward mid-game to end-game closure. So I think very strong game by Takuji, and he still had ample time left. So I think they start off with 25 minutes each. He probably used, slightly less than half. So yeah, let's jump into finals game 1. So maybe let me just toggle it through the drop down list to finals game 1, and we'll run through, and yeah, basically we can leave this up to finals game 3. So over here again, using the center board, probably easier for you guys viewing at home. So let's run through finals game 1. So basically Alejandro Di Mate, he chose, I think he chose black to start with. So against Matthias, who has a wide range of openings, so he played the white diagonal against black, so that's kind of surprising. And Di Mate selected Snake. So Snake is a very edge play driven, and obviously Di Mate, we all know him as a very extreme type of style player. So Matthias, probably more orthodox, very knowledgeable in openings, very versatile in making the games complicated. So I think it's a good matchup between both players in the finals. So over here, Di Mate played a slight variation to kind of jump in to f5. And then create that pocket space for white to go to b3. I think this is still within book, so this sequence is still kind of within book. Up to here, probably a slight deviation than the norm, but still a very nice opening for black to kind of play to. So I think the special thing about Di Mate's games is that his openings can be very creative. He even plays X squares openings very well. So yeah, he's quite an amazing player. So he's able to kind of convert. So over here, white and black just do a quick mid-game crisscross, followed by black jumping into the center. I think black kind of carved out a good shape for himself into the center, even though it started off a bit dispersive for black. So I think Di Mate seems to like this kind of opening whereby they open up dispersively and then kind of regroup into the center again. So it's quite a nice opening style to have. So over here, nothing too surprising. I think if you were to look through the sequence, basically white takes g5, and then black taking here to the quiet move. Obviously g4 could also be an option, but probably just a quick one this flip to d8 is also enough. White regroup, cross back, black jumps in, just wait for white to kind of break out, and then black regroups, white cuts in. So I think nothing too surprising over here. White black forming that standard one square pocket, at the same time gaining one more tempo to f7 potentially. So white jumps in, removes that excess. Black goes for kind of like a very passive planar shape to the top and just kind of wait for white to break in. Even at this stage, I think as I was watching the game live, I think it was already black's game, and I kind of concluded that Di Mate would actually win this game due to tempo. I think he is quite ahead in terms of tempo. So over here, once white takes this, this becomes like a passive shape to the bottom, regardless of where white plays. If white feeds off the edge, black grabs it with no more moves for white to the right side. So typically what you want to do is kind of take control to the edge tempo. Over here, I think black has already successfully carved out enough tempo for him to do that. So that's why he played b1, just to close off the game. So over here, black jumped in. So it's kind of like a bit of a head and tail. White takes the hit, and the tail end is a3, carves out the shape. Over here, I think black could have jumped into the b2 x square, or maybe feed off perhaps, but black didn't go for it. Black went for h6, which isn't too bad either. They kind of secure another pocket space for himself. And then black jumps in over here. I think finally black decided to kind of set up this thing first before going in. And then this move seems to be a bit surprising, but it does make sense when you want to kind of block off the edge shape. You want to just kind of carve out that shape first to secure parity for yourself as black. So I think this is entirely fine. So this one is quite a nice cut out, basically to establish parity, this being the spare move to g8. Probably that's going to be the last move. So yeah, basically the carve out here over here to the odd region to the top, since black doesn't have access here as well, it's just simply to do a black feet and center combination, and then followed by closing off at parity. So it's a very nice sequence for black to kind of close it off this way, very natural. Yeah, so I think a very strong game by Di Matteo over here to kind of close off game 1. And obviously, he was quite on a roll, 9 out of 11 games, top of the table, winning game 1 of the finals. I think probably put him at a good position, both in terms of momentum and morale. So let's jump into game 2 and take a quick look at game 2. So we now move on to game 2 of the finals. Alejandro Di Mate, this time playing white, and Matthias playing black. So obviously Matthias over here has his back against the wall. It's a best of 3. He has to at least win 1 back in order to kind of have a chance in this finals. So let's quickly run through the sequence. So Matthias with black, and interestingly Di Mate has played white diagonal. So I think diagonal tends to be a little bit more popular in Europe as compared to Asian countries or Japan for that matter. I think most players play perpendicular in general. So over here, Matthias plays a very interesting branch out to the edge, which is the Heath opening, and goes for the Iwasaki variation of B5. So I think even though I did create this opening video on Iwasaki variation, but I don't really have a very in-depth understanding or application knowledge of using this opening. So I think Matthias, obviously he has a wide range of openings, and he does understand these openings very well. So I think up till here it's pretty much a book sequence. Basically I think it's still fairly even at this stage. White plays towards the edge to kind of even out the situation. Black feeds off the edge. I think after this exchange, it almost seems as though black has already gained an early advantage, in my opinion, because over here, basically black has a slight tempo advantage. So white branches out, tries to kind of keep the shape regular. Black continues to poison that position. If white were to jump into f4 to chase down the access to c1, black can simply fill it up. So over here, I kind of see it as something that, as you know, white chasing after that tempo while black is defending it. So I see a slight advantage for black in this case. So white just does a g1, establishes e3, chases down the access to c1. Black plays f4 as a prevention move. So that's nice. And followed by white chasing down that access again. Black could probably choose to extend further or take the move. So prevention means taking h4, basically removing f4 this, which is the access that provides white to c1, or taking a move as c1, poisoning it, making it less favorable would only mean b2, which doesn't make sense to an early x square. So black went for the prevention method. Usually we say prevention is better than cure. In this case, prevention better than taking the move itself or blocking it. Make white kind of play around it and try to gain access. So up till this point, you can see black has kind of like a very firm stranglehold on the game situation against white. So I would say it's pretty much black's game even from here. Yeah, so definitely white did play a very nice struggle move to h2, try to gain back the access, try to pressure black, make it difficult for black to play perhaps. Not too sure whether c1 could have worked out, like play c1, feed a1, and then maybe play out to the edge bottom in terms of access play. But over here, I think black probably considered it, but decided that it could be too risky, so he decided to play safe, play out. Which sometimes it's good, but sometimes it does lose you the game. So over here, this exchange with black jumping out, white going into this feat, which is a poison feat, because it based on all these moves on c6 and c7, these are poison. So black jumps into the center, white secures quiet moves either to c6 or f6. In this case, white chose f6, with black taking, surprisingly, this entire sweep, but probably still in the lead, and white jumping out to the center. Over here, there is slight hope for white, but I think because of this maneuver or this shape over here, black is still in firm control. So black jumps into the center, continues to maintain the shape. So I think white wanted to break out of this shape since it was locking himself, but the cost was probably a bit high. And black with this very nice diagonal cut swindle, so it's almost like two consecutive moves. In Japanese we call it renda. Renda means, or renta basically means to make consecutive moves in the same region. So with black playing a very nice h5 with that momentary diagonal control between c6 to f3, white doesn't have access to g2, so that allows black to take two consecutive moves within the same area, the g2. So with that tempo kind of evaporation, it's pretty much black's game, and white was forced to give up the x square. So over here, I think pretty much an endgame closeout, which I think typically top players wouldn't miss once you gain that advantage. So a very nice kind of opening variation, Iwasaki variation for black against the white diagonal game, and moving on to a 1-1 drawing level, and then pushing it to a game 3 basically. So let's move on to game 3 just to review that quickly. So surprisingly, with both players one game apiece, game 3 proved to be a bit of a tense affair. Alejandro Di Mattei going with black. I'm not too sure if he chose it himself, but it was the color that he won in for game 1, I think. So obviously black has won all games. Maybe that's why Di Mattei has decided to play it. So he plays out a typical Stephenson variation over here, and over here white chooses no kung over Karmoth. I think Matthias is very strong in no kung. So instead of going for the orthodox e6, black has decided to go with c6 combination. So c6 is also not too bad a variation to play. So this up to here is pretty much a book sequence, I guess, and then followed by black's e2 is also a book sequence, and then white jumping into d2. And yeah, over here again, black to e1 is also still fairly book, but at the same time you can see black's discs are all kind of spread out, and then while white is grouped into the center. And surprisingly, this opening does work out for black because it's kind of a spread out and then followed by a regroup into the center kind of opening. So you can see that Di Mattei does like this kind of openings, which is interesting to see. So the key move over here of winning was actually I think white's key mistake was actually g6. So even though g6 does regroup the disc very nicely, but it's still flipping 4 discs in 2 different directions early on in the opening, and probably forming a very easy way to kind of penetrate. In fact, a more compact shape to b5 might be more favorable. So if white were to play the b5, form a more compact shape, most of black's moves would still kind of be around that area, and it would be relatively safer as opposed to white's g6. It does gain a slight advantage offhand. I think on the surface it does look very nice, but at the same time it allows black to kind of just penetrate and jump into e7 into the center, providing black with a lot of options. So over here, when white defended this was the key move that black made that probably carved out the win. Once black played h3, not a difficult move to find because you can identify simply that f5 this is very valuable, and it gives you options to c2 and also to f7 over here. So it's not difficult to kind of play h3, especially if h3 h4 kind of feeds off a potential unbalanced edge for white to the right edge. So it's still not a bad opening, definitely for black, and still a very good shape. So I think after white plays g6 and allows black to play this maneuver out, it became super difficult for white to kind of maintain the tempo somehow, because you realize after 2 moves to the left for white, it pretty much carved out a whole area for black in terms of options, and black does still have a couple of more moves to the right and to the top. So with black playing g3, usually g3 move is not that favored, but in this case g3 h4 creates a lot of poison to the top. So that's interesting. So I did see this sequence while I was watching it live, feeding off to h4 and at the same time going for a c8 feed off. So maybe black white followed by black squeeze in, it will cause a lot of problems for white. So interestingly, this caused or forced an error out of Matthias, and Matthias played something unexpected, which is c1, which actually gives off even more tempo, I feel. Maybe c8, b8, c7 followed by maybe even a g8 to kind of form a pair or a 6-disc balance edge may not be as detrimental, perhaps. like this move followed by this. Maybe still playable perhaps, but black could follow with the head and tail quiet move sequence with 2 tempos in. Probably that's something that Matthias wanted to avoid. So let's just go back to the original game. But unfortunately, Matthias played c1. I think it might be slightly worse off in terms of tempo because it gives black a very clear-cut e8, and followed by white forcing to d1 and black just simply ignoring it to c7. And after this exchange of tempo was done, you realize white pretty much lost all of its moves to the top, and there's only a very dangerous bottom right, and I think the game was pretty much over here. So it was kind of a surprise factor given that the finals was so tight and it was a 1 game apiece affair. So surprisingly, it ended off with quite a quick note within the finals just by a mid-game mistake by Matthias. So Matthias did play an extremely good tournament, but unfortunately to kind of slip up in this finals game like this, probably quite a waste. But yeah, black kind of did enough to kind of firmly set up the end game. So very strong sequence by Alejandro Di Mate, and to kind of close off the game via a swindle. So a very nice game by both players, and obviously a very nice tournament throughout. And yeah, definitely think that it's an extremely well organized tournament and well played by all players. So hopefully everyone enjoyed this tournament and also this video, and thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you at the next event review video. So yep, let's catch you next time. Goodbye.